You were never meant to hear this. The records were burned, the witnesses erased, and the ruins sealed in concrete. But still, the story leaks through the cracks like a scent of decay that never dies. Before I start this story, welcome to the Macabre History Channel. If you like this kind of storytelling, then please like and subscribe to my channel, and don't forget to press the bell icon. Ravencrest wasn't built to be a home. It was a container, a tomb in disguise, a Highland manor meant not to house the living, but to preserve the dead. And the Halberts, they were its faithful curators. Not a family, not anymore, not for a long time. The first time someone saw the body, it was seated upright in a dining chair, dressed in white, hair braided, lips painted, her eyes stitched shut with thread the color of dried blood. That was the moment the village of Blackmore began to fracture. Not because someone had died, death was common, but because the Halberts had refused to let her go. This wasn't grief, this was design. You're about to descend into a story that has been quarantined from the history books, because it calls into question everything you've been taught about death, soul, science, and family. You've heard of grieving widowers and mourning children, but you've never heard of a man who preserved his wife's corpse with a secret formula, kept her warm by the fire for years, and spoke to her each night like she'd just blink slowly and stop moving. Her name was Eleanor, and according to Magnus Halbert, she wasn't dead. Not really. The year was 1798. A harsh Scottish winter raged outside Ravencrest, but inside time stood still. The doctor fled. The priest was turned away. The sheriff shrugged at paperwork bound in flesh. Because Magnus didn't believe in funerals, he believed in thresholds. Thin veils, ancient techniques pulled from heretical books bound in ton. Guess long buried. This wasn't about sentiment, it was about power, the kind that feeds on silence, secrecy, and the belief that death is not the end. You will want to look away, but you won't. Because the deeper we go, the more this tale stops feeling like a story and starts feeling like a mirror. What if death isn't final? What if someone already proved it? And what if that someone never died at all? Welcome to Ravencrest. Welcome to the Halberts. They never buried their dead. They kept them, watching. They say madness grows in isolation, but the Halberts didn't go mad. They evolved. Magnus wasn't muttering into the darkness. He was speaking to something no one else could hear, something ancient, something that answers only those who silence the noise of the world. When the villagers saw Eleanor's corpse moved from room to room, seated in the parlor on Sunday, placed at the piano on Thursday, they whispered of grief. But it wasn't grief, it was ritual. The manor itself became a machine, a living cathedral to memory, decay, and control. The rooms weren't designed to comfort the living. They were calibrated to keep the dead from leaving. The children adapted. They had no choice. William, just 16, read to his mother each night, never missing a chapter, his voice steady even as her lips split and cracked from dryness. Charlotte, 13, was quieter, always watching, always listening. Her journal, found years later, contains one chilling line repeated over and over in feverish ink. Still warm, still warm, still warm. But it was young Thomas who gave the villagers chills. He asked them when his mother would wake up, asked it not with sadness but with certainty, as if he'd been promised a return, as if her stillness was merely sleep, not silence. And maybe it was. Magnus didn't just preserve her with chemicals. He preserved the family, froze them in time like a painting sealed behind glass. Death wasn't allowed to finish its work. It was stopped mid-sentence, and in that interruption, something else seeped in, something older than the church, something that does not tolerate rot because it feeds on denial. The villagers kept their distance, but every so often someone would catch a glimpse of Eleanor through the window, her head turning ever so slightly, her gaze following them into the fog. Imagination, they told themselves, but every man has a point where disbelief becomes fear, and Blackmore was reaching its limit. Because the Halberts weren't grieving, they were waiting, and something or someone was beginning to answer. No one dared confront Magnus directly, not after what the sheriff saw in the parlor. Eleanor, dressed in ivory lace, her jaw wired shut, Her hands posed mid-knitting, but she hadn't moved from rigor. Someone had moved her, purposefully, lovingly, as if positioning a mannequin to deceive a god. The villagers stopped calling it madness. They started calling it heresy. And that shift from pitiful to profane is where the true fear began, because Magnus didn't just defy custom, he defied the divine. He rejected the soul's exit. He anchored it. Visitors, rare and uninvited, reported impossible things. Eleanor's body never smelled of rot. Her skin remained pale, tight, cold but not decaying, and her eyes, stitched shut, twitched, they said, beneath the thread, like something behind a curtain still trying to see. Magnus claimed it was the effect of his preservative formula, a method developed through years of experimentation, but those who heard his voice when he described it swore it wasn't science, it was devotion, ritualistic, sacred, untouchable. Behind locked doors, Magnus worked, but not alone. The children were being taught, not in arithmetic, but anatomy, not in history, but resistance to the natural order. Charlotte was seen drawing diagrams of veins and pressure points in her journal. William collected small animals from the woods and returned with notes on their lifeless postures. And Thomas began hearing whispers through the walls, voices, he claimed, coming from the cellar. Not voices of the dead, voices of the not quite dead. And still, no one intervened, because those who got close began to change. They started dreaming of their own dead, waking with the smell of rosewater and decay on their pillows. One constable was found sleepwalking toward Ravencrest with a shovel and a prayer book in his hands. Another was seen placing salt in a circle around his infant daughter's crib. And yet Magnus never threatened anyone. He never left the estate. All he did was wait. He knew something the rest didn't, that death is a curtain, and the Halberts had learned how to reach behind it. You're not watching a family unravel. You're watching one transcend. By spring, Ravencrest had become a cathedral of the preserved. Eleanor's corpse was no longer the only occupant. William, once alive with books and questions, now sat eternally in his favorite armchair, a leather-bound volume opened in stiff, gray fingers. His death had been ruled an accident, a misfire in the woods. But those who saw the body before Magnus sealed the doors again swore there were no gunpowder burns, just a hole in the chest, perfectly round, precisely centered, as if the rifle hadn't misfired at all, but had been aimed by something steady, or someone determined. And still, Magnus didn't bury him. He preserved him, just like Eleanor, just like the others, because now there were others. Behind closed doors, new corpses appeared, not Halberts, not family, but preserved just the same. School teachers who vanished, a chimney sweep whose tools were found on the edge of the forest, a local widow whose cottage was discovered abandoned with dinner still on the stove. They didn't rot, they didn't stink. They sat quietly in Ravencrest, in postures chosen for them, as if Magnus was building something, a scene, a theater of stillness. Those few who stepped inside described a room arranged like a living tableau. Eleanor at the hearth, William in the library, others dressed in borrowed finery, staged like dinner guests in a frozen celebration. The children walked among them, silent and obedient, never blinking too long, never breaking the illusion. Thomas would nod to the corpses like classmates. Charlotte would fix their clothing. William, even in death, was treated like a guide. It was no longer mourning, it was worship. And then came the paperwork, yellowed documents Magnus showed to the sheriff when he returned, a family covenant, written in a language half Latin, half unknown. Wax seals shaped like eyes and spirals, one line translated simply to, the dead belong to the blood. The sheriff didn't press further, no one did, because even the law knows when it's looking at something older than authority. This wasn't a family home anymore. It was a machine powered by death and memory, and Magnus Halbert was his priest. The dead were not decorations, they were the blueprint. Each preserved body, positioned, recorded, altered, was part of Magnus's greater work. He didn't just keep them from rotting, he studied their stillness, measured it, adjusted it, because death to Magnus Halbert wasn't a moment, it was a process, one that could be slowed, paused, even reversed if the right formula, The right alignment, the right willingness to defy God was in place. The East Wing became his sanctum. Emily Sutton was the first outsider to enter it willingly, a grieving widow from the village drawn to Magnus not by madness but by hope. Her journal, later found scorched but intact, described walls lined with diagrams of circulatory loops, preservation tanks made of polished brass and warped glass, and an overwhelming stench that was not decay, but memory steeped in formaldehyde. She described Magnus as calm, articulate, almost kind. He spoke of death as a temporary departure, a door closed with a soft click, not a bang. And beneath that wing, under floorboards stained black with years of spilled chemical, the laboratory pulsed with impossible machinery. Tubes leading into cadavers, needles gently rocking in and out of veins. Some bodies twitched, others moaned through stitched lips. These were not experiments to Magnus, these were preparations. Emily wrote of strange hours where he would speak in tongues, syllables not rooted in any earthly dialect, as he inserted bone fragments into preserved spines and dripped blue solution onto gray flesh. She called it reverse embalming. He called it recall, the act of inviting the soul back home. And the children watched all of it, not with fear, with reverence. Charlotte carried books older than the manor itself, pages filled with anatomical drawings that merged into symbols. William, dead and propped upright, had wires affixed to his fingers that pulse faintly with light, and Thomas began asking questions no child should. If the soul is heat, how do we warm the dead from inside? This wasn't grief. This was ascension by dissection, and the worst part, he was getting results. The first time something spoke back, it came through William's corpse, not with a voice but a gesture. Emily described it in her journal with shaking ink. His finger twitched, then turned the page. No one else was in the room. No draft, no trick, just a corpse and a book, and a gesture so subtle it wouldn't have mattered if it weren't impossible. She ran to Magnus, breathless. He didn't act surprised. He only asked, "What was the passage?" When she told him, a paragraph on cellular memory, he smiled like a man watching a sunrise. That was when she understood. Magnus wasn't trying to raise the dead. He was trying to continue them, to thread their consciousness back into their forms, not with rituals alone, but with rules, laws of motion, sequence, preservation, and intention. But rules imply something deeper, that the dead can be negotiated with. And in the following weeks, negotiation began. Emily reported hearing whispers in languages she'd never learned, not from Magnus, not from the children, but from inside the walls, from the floor beneath the preserved, from the air around the cold, whispers that didn't just echo, they asked things, questions with no voice but unbearable weight. Do you remember me? Who pulled me back? What am I missing? The children began answering, not aloud, through actions. Charlotte started leaving food beside Eleanor's chair, food that vanished by morning. Thomas began drawing faces, faces no one recognized, then crumpling the pages and whispering, "Not right, not yet." Magnus documented everything. Patterns emerged, shifts in temperature, movement in the air, a rhythm to the body's stiffness, like the tension of a violin string just before it's plucked. The villagers, meanwhile, saw lights again, strange pulsing flashes from Ravencrest at midnight, eclipsing the fog, chanting, animal cries cut short, and now they didn't whisper madness. They whispered summoning, because somewhere beyond the veil, Magnus was stitching back together. Something had seen the needle, and it had started pulling thread. It was no longer a home, not even a laboratory. Ravencrest had become an architecture of return. Every corridor calculated, every chair's angle precise, each preserved body placed as if answering to an unseen blueprint etched into the manor's very stone. Charlotte began placing stones beneath Eleanor's feet, geometric in design, aligned with magnetic north. Thomas dragged chalk across the floor, tracing spirals older than scripture. And Emily, no longer merely grieving, now devoted, began to call it what Magnus refused to say aloud, the array. The manor itself was the mechanism, a map of soul tethering. Each preserved corpse wasn't just a relic. It was a node, a stabilizer, a beacon. And Magnus, in his cold certainty, began placing the living alongside the dead to balance the pulse. He told Emily, they must know they are remembered. They must feel us waiting. And so they did. Visitors were placed beside the corpses, fed the same meals, spoke aloud to cold faces as if engaging in a dinner conversation. Some obeyed out of terror, others out of trance, because being inside Ravencrest for too long did something to the mind, not like madness, but like reprogramming. Time bent, memories blurred. One constable spent 3 days inside and returned to the village believing it was still 1795. Another woman claimed Eleanor had spoken to her, not in words but in scent, rose oil and sulfur whispering, "You left me too soon." And Magnus, he kept building. Below the east wing, a new chamber, carved from the stone with tools not sold in any shop, a circle of iron embedded in the floor, at its center a slab, not a table, not a bed, but something in between, like a place where a body waits to be invited back. Emily called it the crossing. One night Thomas placed his hand on it. He smiled and said, "She's almost here." And then the door turned. It was Charlotte who found the page, tucked into the spine of an ancient ledger bound in stretched hide and inked in something not quite brown. A ritual, incomplete. Instructions that read like poetry written by a surgeon. It didn't name resurrection. It named restoration. The act of bringing the soul not back from death, but from where it had been misfiled. Magnus stared at it for hours, his fingers twitching like he was already tracing incisions into the air. And on the coldest night of November 1803, they prepared the chamber. They chose Eleanor. Of course it was Eleanor. She had waited the longest, preserved, adored, positioned, but never spoken through, until now. Her corpse was placed on the stone slab, her skin, waxen but intact, her jaw unstitched. Charlotte stood at her feet, Emily at her head, Magnus with the book, his voice a low vibration, not speech but rhythm, a summons pretending to be scripture. The ritual began with breath, not Eleanor's, theirs. Each one exhaled into a brass tube fitted to her mouth, as if breathing into her. Then the circle was closed. Thomas stepped in, completing the line, placing a bone fragment over her sternum. Emily cried, not from grief, from expectation. Something would happen, something had to. And then it did. Her fingers curled, not all the way, just enough. Emily gasped. Charlotte whispered, "She's answering." And Magnus, he trembled. For the first time, the corpse blinked. It didn't open its eyes. It blinked. A twitch in stitched lids now free. Her lips moved, but no sound, just the whisper of dry skin trying to remember moisture. Thomas clutched the slab. Eleanor turned her head toward him, stiff, unnatural, but directed. She saw him, and from deep within her chest came the first sound, not breath, not voice. It was a choke, wet, gasping, ragged, like something drowning in memory. She moved, and they did not stop her, because they couldn't. She did not come back as Eleanor. What rose from that slab may have remembered the family's names, but it spoke them in the wrong order, with the wrong inflection, like trying on someone else's language. Her eyes never fully opened. They flickered beneath lids stitched for years. But the body moved, not like the dead given motion, but like a prisoner walking in a room too small for its rage. Eleanor stood, disjointed, trembling, head tilted like listening to something beneath the stone, and spoke one sentence. "You broke the rhythm." Emily collapsed. Charlotte screamed. Thomas smiled. Only Magnus didn't move. He watched her, trembling, not in fear, but awe. "She's speaking," he whispered. "She's returned." But what stood before them didn't embrace, didn't weep. It moved past them toward the hall, slow and stiff as if adjusting to gravity or resisting it. Every gas lamp flickered, mirrors cracked, the wind outside stopped. And down the main hall, portraits of the family, oil paintings 3 generations deep, peeled away from the walls, not fell, peeled, like the house itself recoiled. Eleanor paused at the hearth, sat in her old chair, turned toward the empty piano, and smiled. Her mouth tore at the corners. Charlotte fell to her knees. She remembers, she whispered. But Magnus whispered back, that's not what she's remembering, because the corpse began to hum, a song none of them recognized, a melody that shifted every time you listened, like it was trying on faces. Thomas swayed to it, the fire turned blue, and Emily, poor devoted Emily, began whispering the words as if they'd always been there in the back of her mind, foreign syllables, ancient shapes, a language that didn't evolve but waited. That night, Eleanor did not sleep. She sat, eyes half closed, lips mumbling softly, and in the morning, all the other corpses in Ravencrest had changed position, on their own. One had turned its head, one now sat upright, and William's corpse was gone. William's body was not stolen, misplaced, or moved. It was claimed. When Magnus searched the manor, he didn't call out his son's name. He listened. Every floorboard creak, every breathless gap in the silence. Something had changed in the wood, in the bones of the house. Ravencrest was no longer merely shelter. It was responding. Emily whispered it first. The rooms. They're not where they used to be. Doors opened to the wrong halls. The east wing extended by 20 paces overnight. A staircase appeared leading downward that no one had built. Stone, wet, old. Charlotte followed that staircase alone. At the bottom, she found William, seated on a chair made of antlers and iron, his skin waxy pale, but his head slowly turning as she entered. His lips moved, no sound but motion. Then he raised his hand and pointed to a wall that hadn't been there yesterday, and on that wall was a new portrait, painted in oils, of Eleanor sitting exactly where she had the night before, with eyes wide open and something in her lap, a second version of William, half-formed, melting into her. Charlotte ran, but the halls would not let her go the same way twice, because Ravencrest was alive now, not in metaphor. Its geometry bent inward. Windows faced blank stone, mirrors reflected faces that weren't yours. The dead began appearing in places no one placed them. Eleanor in the sewing room, though no one moved her. Thomas's drawings depicting rooms they hadn't built yet. And on the third night, Magnus carved a symbol into the main door, a mark from his oldest journal, meant to ground the tether. But the symbol disappeared by morning, replaced by one no one recognized. Thomas claimed the house had drawn it. Emily stopped sleeping, said the floor whispered in breath. Charlotte grew silent, pale, slow. Magnus still recorded everything, but his entries now ended with phrases like, "She sees from the walls, and I'm not the one in control anymore." The family had awakened the dead, but the house had awakened something else. And then the heartbeat began. Faint at first, like a pulse beneath the floorboards. Thomas was the first to hear it, lying flat against the wood with one ear down. "She's still building," he whispered, "but now it's moving." No one understood what he meant, until the walls began to breathe. Paintings shifted subtly when no one watched. Cold air blew upward from the cellar vents, though the hearths were lit, and the sound, the slow, rhythmic thump, grew louder by the day. Magnus tried to explain it away as auditory illusion, a pressure differential. But Emily, eyes bloodshot, hands shaking, confronted him one night in the corridor and said, "I bled into the stone, Magnus, and it bled back." She pulled up her skirt and showed her leg. It was wrapped in linen soaked red. The stone in the east corridor had sliced her, not jaggedly, precisely, as if marking her, tagging her. The next morning, Thomas was missing. His drawings remained, though. Hundreds, taped to the walls, scattered across the floor, scrawled over mirrors, wood, skin, and they all depicted the same thing, a creature. Not quite human, not quite corpse, a hybrid of the preserved and the evolving, long limbs, hollow face, bent like mourning, but standing like conquest. The creature was always inside Ravencrest, watching, growing, waiting, and in the center of every drawing, one word, matriarch. Emily began to chant in her sleep. Charlotte no longer responded to her name, and Magnus, who once lectured on the limits of science, now stood in the crossing chamber with arms outstretched, whispering to the air, "Tell me what's next. Tell me what to build." And the walls answered, with heat. The stone glowed, the floor cracked, and from beneath the house came a sound no one could unhear, wet breath drawn through too many mouths, because something had been born, not summoned, not raised, constructed, and it no longer needed a family, it needed a body. It spoke first through Charlotte, not in her voice, but with it. Magnus found her in the nursery, staring out the window at nothing, lips twitching like a silent hymn. When he touched her shoulder, she turned, smiled with both kindness and contempt, and said, "The womb is wide. The dead arrive easily now." He staggered back. "Charlotte?" She blinked, just once, then said, "You shouldn't have sealed the east wing. She remembers every door you close." Emily dropped her journal when she heard it. "It's her," she whispered. "It's the matriarch. She's using them." And that night it wasn't just Charlotte. Thomas reappeared but changed, slow to speak, twitching at the joints, drawing spirals not in ink but blood from his own fingers. He sat at the base of the staircase where William once had, staring into corners as if watching a procession only he could see. Emily tried to burn one of the drawings. The fire recoiled, turned green, then black, then sank into itself. She fainted, clutching her chest, and later described seeing Eleanor's face in reverse, mouth open, but the scream going inward. She was swallowing the sound. From that night forward, no one used names. They became vessels. Charlotte was not Charlotte. Thomas was not Thomas. Even Magnus began referring to himself in the third person, calling his reflections the architect. The house had no hours, only cycles. Rooms grew warmer when Charlotte spoke, colder when Thomas sang. The matriarch's influence spread like mildew in the walls, subtle at first, then consuming. Mirrors no longer reflected the present. They showed the near future, and in them Ravencrest stood empty but full, with Eleanor seated at every window, watching herself. On the seventh day, the villagers heard a sound unlike any church bell, a tone too low, too thick, that seeped into teeth. And on that same day, Ravencrest grew another floor. The villagers noticed first, not through screams or fire, but through forgetting. Roads that once led away from Ravencrest now circled back. A well-used path toward the western hills simply ended, as if never carved. Blackmore's clocks drifted out of sync. Animals refused to cross the manor's shadow, as if sensing a second gravity beneath it. One farmer collapsed in the fields, muttering about roots that whispered his name. Another saw Eleanor's face in a pail of water, smiling even as he poured it out. Sheriff Mercer, now a gray-eyed shell of law, attempted one final intervention. He arrived with 4 men, only 2 returned, barefoot, mute, and covered in a fine dust like ash soaked in oil. One of them coughed out a child's tooth. That same evening, Ravencrest shed its walls, literally. Stone peeled back like skin, revealing not wood or plaster but veins, black roots pulsing with a rhythm that no longer mirrored any human heartbeat. A storm gathered overhead, yet no rain fell, just mist, thick metallic clinging. It seeped into the village's wells, and for a week everyone dreamed in the same sequence: corridors, empty rooms, and a whisper from behind the wall. "You are not guests. You are extensions." Charlotte now walked without blinking. Thomas, when he spoke backward, and Magnus carved doors into air, outlines drawn with bone dust that shimmered, then opened into places no one had ever built. Behind one such door, Emily glimpsed a massive version of Eleanor, 50 feet tall, stitched to the ceiling of a cathedral made of teeth. They tried to warn the town, sent letters, scratched symbols in tree bark, but the words decayed upon reading, the ink bleeding into warnings like, "She sees this. Stop writing her name. The house is breathing again." And by the full moon, Blackmore's church bell tolled 12 times at midnight, even though the bell had been removed 3 years earlier. And still it spread, not just across land, but across lineage. Old family Bibles in Blackmore began displaying new names written in handwriting no one remembered writing. Census records shifted. The Halberts were now listed in decades they hadn't lived. Gravestones, once weathered and clear, bore birth dates before they were born, as if Ravencrest was not only warping space but time itself, folding it inward so that all roads, all branches, all memories led back to her. The matriarch had become a concept, not alive, not dead, just present in everything. A hum in glass, a shadow at noon, a name you almost say before coughing it out like a swallowed tooth. Emily awoke one night to find pages missing from her journal, the ones about Eleanor's first awakening. In their place were diagrams of spines, of nervous systems, of blueprints for skin, and on every one the same symbol, a wide eye nested inside an open womb. She began sketching it on the walls compulsively, even in sleep. Charlotte had stopped speaking altogether. She only stared now, unblinking, unbreathing for hours. But when she finally did whisper again, it was one sentence. She remembers who doubted. Across Blackmore, women miscarried on the same night, 12 of them. Everyone claimed to have dreamed of Eleanor's face, inside them, watching from behind their ribs. In the manor, walls began displaying moving images, not paintings, but memories. Eleanor's memories, births, deaths, experiments, not all from her lifetime, some from centuries earlier, some from future wars that hadn't yet been fought. And in each vision the Halberts stood in the background, unmoved, ageless, staring straight at the viewer. Time began to weep at the seams. And Magnus? He bowed to her now, not as a scientist, not even as a father, but as a scribe, a man recording God rewritten, inked not in truth but in preservation fluid, because the matriarch was not just returning, she was rewriting the book she was never allowed to finish. Sheriff Mercer returned one final time, alone, torch in hand, trembling with a resolve that only comes when a man has nothing left to lose. His wife had stopped recognizing him. His children spoke in tongues when they slept. And last night his reflection had mouthed words he never said. He stood before Ravencrest at dusk, its silhouette bloated against the horizon like a pregnant wound, and whispered, "You don't belong here." The front door opened before he knocked. Inside, the halls no longer smelled of dust and death. They smelled of skin, warm, slick, pulsing. The wallpaper was gone. In its place, stretched parchment etched with veins that twitched when he passed. He made it to the main chamber, where Eleanor sat in a throne made of bedposts and bones. Her eyes were not glass, they were mirrors. He saw his younger self inside them, naked, screaming, dissolving, and still he lit the torch. The flames licked the baseboards, caught the old drapes, but the house didn't burn. It drank. The fire spread across the ceiling in perfect silence, then reversed itself, crawling backward into the torch, which vanished from his hand like a lie he never told. Then the floor opened, not collapsed, opened, like a trapdoor in muscle. Mercer fell. When he awoke, he was not outside, not inside either. He was between, lodged into a wall behind the main staircase, eyes forced open, skin like polished marble, breath slowed to one every 30 seconds. Magnus passed him daily and never spoke, just nodded, as if Mercer was now part of the decor, a fixture, forever watching the threshold, forever listening to Charlotte sing lullabies to no one, forever feeling the heartbeat of a house that should never have been alive. Because Ravencrest had decided if they would not bury the dead, it would house the living. By now, even the insects had vanished from Ravencrest. Nothing crawled, nothing buzzed. The natural world had turned its back. Inside, Charlotte no longer walked. She glided, silent, feet never touching the floorboards that now pulsed like shallow breathing beneath skin. And in her arms, always clutched tight, a rolled scroll, yellowed like organ wrap, inked not in pen, but in spinal fluid. Magnus called it the New Plans. He did not remember drafting them. No one did. But there they were, line after impossible line, diagrams that defied physics and sanity, spiral staircases with no top, doorways that led back to their entrance, chimneys that exited into cellars. Every room restructured not for comfort, but for containment, for ritual. And at the center of the blueprint, a chamber marked only as the Cradle. Emily trembled when she first saw it. "There's no cradle in the house," she whispered. Magnus corrected her gently. "Not yet." The scroll changed daily, as if the house was designing itself through the blood of the children. New additions drew themselves overnight. Veins on the walls pulsed in matching shapes. Furniture rearranged to match the diagrams. And the attic, it disappeared, completely. Gone, as if rewritten out of existence. Charlotte began whispering architectural terms no child her age should know. Load-bearing grief. Flesh mortar. Soul-joined beams. Thomas scratched floor plans into his own arms. When bandaged, the wounds bled in blueprints. They spoke in measurements. They slept in angles. And the matriarch watched it all. Her preserved body had been moved to the center of the structure. Her throne now surrounded by pulsing diagrams, etched into the floor in gold leaf and bile. Magnus stood over her daily, head bowed, reciting lines from journals he'd never written. The child designs the cradle designs the mother. He mother births the house. Ravencrest was no longer a building. It was becoming an organism, and its next evolution would require something divine. And so the cradle was constructed not of wood or silk, but of bone and language, vertebrae for spindles, a skull for a pillow. The lining was sewn from the gowns of the long dead, each threaded with names no longer spoken. No one admitted who built it. One morning it was just there, swaying gently, though no wind passed through Ravencrest's suffocating halls. Charlotte approached it first, her eyes now fully glass, not decorative but functional. She could see what no one else dared. "He's not here yet," she said, tilting her head. "But he remembers us." Then she turned and vomited ink thick and hot onto the floor. It formed a single word. Again. Thomas no longer spoke in sounds, only in smells. He exhaled rot, ash, wet stone, old blood. Magnus wrote it all down, convinced it was a language from before language. "He's close," he whispered to Emily, who had not blinked in days. "He's nearly written back." Inside the cradle, bones began to soften. They bent where they should snap. They pulsed where they should sit still. And from beneath its ribs came something like a heartbeat, but deeper. It shook the walls, not violently, but primally, like a mother recognizing the cry of something she'd buried long ago. That night the moon reflected Ravencrest, not just light, but form, windows, shadows, a second house in the sky, hung like a mirror, and inside that reflection, figures moved, but not the ones in the real house. These were thinner, older, and taller than human. Emily wept, clutching the cradle's frame. "He was never born," she muttered. "Not the first time. That's why he remembers. We didn't make him. We owed him." Then the cradle opened, without hands, without sound, and from within rose a silhouette of light shaped like a child, but flickering like film. Its mouth did not move, but everyone in the house heard it speak inside their blood. "I have returned incomplete. You must build the rest." And across every wall the name Eleanor began to erase itself. After the cradle opened, nothing remained fixed. Not the walls, not the minds, not the past. The house didn't just breathe anymore. It rewrote. Paintings became windows. Windows became mouths. And when you looked through them, you didn't see outside. You saw moments from your own childhood altered. In one, Charlotte saw herself with a mother she didn't remember. In another, Thomas was stillborn, yet walking. Eleanor was no longer the dead. She was the editor of memory, and Ravencrest her manuscript. Each room demanded an offering, not blood, but identity. Emily stepped into the library and forgot her own name. The books had no titles, only blank covers that mirrored her face when she opened them. Each page she read removed a piece of her, her father's face, her wedding day, the scent of her childhood home. In exchange, she remembered things that never happened, an ocean made of teeth, a hymn sung by bones, a god that weeps backwards. Magnus stood before the fireplace and watched his own reflection burn, not in the flames but in the soot, curling upward like smoke made of self. "We are not the Halberts," he said flatly. "We are the correction." He lifted his journal to write, only to find the pages already filled with handwriting not his own. Charlotte began calling Thomas Elias. When Magnus corrected her, she smiled with teeth that were no longer hers. "There was never a Thomas," she said. "You just remembered him wrong." And when Magnus looked again, she was right. There were no toys, no footprints, just a chair that had always been empty. The house had begun to feed, but what it consumed wasn't flesh. It was story, the personal, the sacred, the painful, and in its place it left narratives that served her return. Everything they had ever been was being overwritten, line by line, like a corrupted gospel. And Eleanor? She sat in the dining hall, mouth closed, but eyes alight with the soft joy of a novelist nearing the final chapter. It wasn't just that Ravencrest refused to rot, it was that truth itself was now being embalmed, preserved, posed, and reauthored to match the desires of the matriarch's eternal plot. And then came the outsiders, drawn by rumor, legend, the thrill of forbidden knowledge. 2 researchers from the University of Edinburgh, a psychic from Dover, and one man who claimed to be Magnus's great-great-grandson. They arrived with cameras, journals, EMF detectors, thinking they were walking into history. But Ravencrest had already prepared their rooms. Their names were carved into the backs of the bed frames aged by dust. Their photos were in the hallway, posed beside people they didn't recognize but who all had their smiles. The psychic wept immediately. "This place doesn't have ghosts," she whispered. "It has drafts, unfinished versions of people, and we're part of it." She placed her hand on the banister and screamed, not from pain but from memory. "This isn't my first time here," she choked. "I was born in this hallway, but my mother was made of stairs." The man claiming blood ties to Magnus tried to denounce it all as hysteria until he saw the library's ledger. There, beside Magnus's signature, was his own name, dated 1866, written in identical hand. "That's not possible," he gasped. But the house had already begun editing him. His accent shifted mid-sentence, his memories realigned like misfiled manuscripts. When asked his birth year again, he paused. "I don't remember it having numbers." One researcher vanished completely. The other found her inside a wardrobe, folded like paper, eyes wide, whispering fragments of nursery rhymes in a language that predated Latin. Her fingernails had grown into runes. She had no tongue, and still she sang. Ravencrest didn't trap them. That would imply intent. No, Ravencrest welcomed them, because it was no longer just a structure, it was a narrative loop, hungry for roles to fill. Charlotte greeted each guest by name, even the ones who never told her. She handed them journals they hadn't written yet. She called them the ones who remember wrongly. By the time they tried to leave, the driveway was gone. The trees no longer pointed in the same direction. The sun set inside the house, flickering behind windows not beyond the horizon. And when one of them finally screamed, "This house wasn't here yesterday," the walls sighed in reply. "It was. You just hadn't been written into it yet." The last outsider, a man named Callum Reeves, still believed in resistance. He waited until nightfall, found the journal Charlotte had placed in his coat pocket, its leather cover warm like skin, the stitching pulsing faintly. He took it to the east wing, where the windows still wept fog, and set it ablaze with a match torn from the bone drawer. The flames hissed, not like paper burning, but like lungs exhaling. Ink bled upward in black veins. The fire roared, and then bent, curved, and stopped midair, frozen, suspended like a photograph of combustion. And inside it, Callum saw his own face, not present day, but childlike, terrified, as if he were 5 again, and watching something impossible through a keyhole he never remembered finding. He grabbed the journal from the flame, but it didn't burn. It bled. Red at first, then something darker, thicker, as if each word he read was connected to a vein in his spine. He turned the pages, desperate to unwrite himself, but the entries were already complete, dated, signed, punctuated, and every sentence ended in his own handwriting. Panicking, he ran to the dining room. Eleanor still sat unmoving, but her head had turned, just slightly, her glass eyes pointed at the cradle, now closed and rocking slowly. "You shouldn't have done that," Charlotte said behind him. Her voice wasn't angry. It was sad, like a mother watching a child dig up something meant to stay buried. Callum screamed, "You're not real! This isn't real!" But the room pulsed in agreement, because it wasn't his reality. It was theirs. The manuscript was the house. The walls were the grammar. The corpses were the punctuation. The Halberts didn't trap people, they rewrote them. And Callum was simply a draft, still wet with meaning, still being edited by a matriarch who did not need permission to revise. He tore pages from the journal. His teeth broke. He howled. But the words he ripped out didn't vanish. They appeared on the walls in Eleanor's scrawl, line after line. The fire is not a threat. The fire is a reminder. The fire is a reader. And then he saw it. His own skeleton, seated in the next room, journal still open, pen in hand. He'd never left. He'd always been here. He just hadn't remembered being read yet. And then the cradle opened again, not gently this time, but with a spasm, a violent gasp that echoed through Ravencrest like a scream exhaled in reverse. Dust flew upward, the walls flexed, and from within its blackened hollow came not a child, not a corpse, but a memory, old, coiled, and impossibly intact. It wasn't a vision or a ghost. It was a place, a church that never had walls, a language that spoke only in temperature, a fire that remembered every soul it ever touched. Time inside the house cracked, paint peeled backward, wood regrew, the candles unburned themselves. Eleanor's eyes flickered, not open, but inward, like mirrors turning to face the soul. Suddenly, it was 1741, then 1889, then something before calendars. The cradle wasn't just a relic, it was a keystone to a door made of repetition, and Magnus had never built it to preserve life, but to house what had no body left. The family had been assigned, not born. They were not descendants of trauma, but its scaffolding, crafted across generations to contain what even language dared not define. Charlotte fell to her knees. "I remember now," she whispered. "We're not the first Halberts. We're just the current costumes." And Thomas, who had not blinked in hours, began convulsing violently, not in pain, in recognition. He mouthed syllables too old for lungs. Bones shifted under his skin. One arm shrank, one eye sealed shut. He was becoming a vessel, reshaped by something that remembered him differently. Emily tried to run, but the floors had become centuries. Every step dropped her into another time. She saw herself born in a cave. She saw herself burned at a stake. She saw herself give birth to Eleanor under a black eclipse. "It's not a family," she screamed. "It's a structure made of people." Ravencrest no longer occupied a location. It existed across repetition, anchored by the cradle, fed by memory, preserved by blood that refused to dry. The house didn't refuse to rot because it was strong. It refused to rot because decay is linear and Ravencrest is not. And in the cradle, something whispered with Eleanor's voice, but older. "You may not remember building me, but I have always remembered holding you." And then it spread. Not through wind or contagion, but through recognition. The moment Ravencrest remembered it was never alone. The village of Blackmore began to shift, not visibly at first, but subtly, like a dream rearranging itself just before waking. Street signs blurred, maps redrew their own lines. The church bell tower, once tall and proud, now rang at the wrong hour, and sometimes rang before the clapper moved. Locals began forgetting their names, then their faces, then their children's birthdays. One man awoke to find a portrait of Eleanor hanging above his fireplace, though he'd lived alone for 30 years. Another discovered that his cellar was bricked shut from the inside, and the bricks were still warm. The constable received a letter requesting an investigation into the house that refuses, dated 1842, signed by himself in a hand he didn't recognize. The postmark read Blackmore, not Blackmore. And when he tried to correct the town ledger, the ink ran upward and formed a single phrase: "The village remembers its mother." Shops began selling items that didn't exist. Lace gloves from 1790, mourning veils stitched with family names no one had spoken in 2 centuries. Children drew pictures of the house without ever seeing it. When asked, they simply said, "She showed us." Even the animals began to avoid the manor, but not from fear, from familiarity, as if they had once been fed there, as if their bones still remembered the call of the cradle. And the villagers began to gather at dusk, at first aimlessly, then intentionally, lining up in silence outside the gates of Ravencrest, eyes blank, lips twitching with half-formed hymns. They didn't knock, they didn't speak, they simply waited, because the house was no longer separate from Blackmore. It was becoming Blackmore, or perhaps it always had been, and the illusion of separation was simply a kindness the sea rattle aloud until it was strong enough to pull everything back into her. Magnus once called Ravencrest a sanctuary for what should not die, but now it was more. Now it was the author. And Blackmore, just another paragraph in a book that has no final page, because Eleanor is writing again. And this time, she's using your name. But one man, old Matthew Graves, the stonemason with shaking hands and cloudy eyes, refused to kneel. He had not yet forgotten his name. Not fully. He remembered building things meant to last, not things meant to whisper. So he took his rusted sledgehammer and staggered toward Ravencrest's iron gate, the same gate that now bore carvings no one had ever chiseled, faces of villagers long dead, eyes closed as if still dreaming. The wind seemed to hum as he approached, a low murmur like breath caught in the throat of something waiting. Matthew raised the hammer and struck. The metal rang out, not with the sound of steel, but like a bone cracked underwater. The air folded in on itself. Trees twisted in place. And the gate? It didn't break. He did. The hammer shattered on impact, and so did Matthew's grip, his fingers splitting not from force but from recognition. Beneath his skin were veins threaded not with blood, but with mortar. Tiny cracks running along his arms like old fault lines rediscovered. He looked down at his hand and screamed, not from pain but from memory. "I forged this gate," he whispered, "but not in 1921, in 1742. He stumbled back, teeth clattering from a mouth now too dry to belong to the living. His breath came as dust. The symbols on the gate pulsed, and when he fell to his knees, his own face joined the others on the iron, eyes closed, mouth open, mid-regret. From the manor, Charlotte watched. No joy, no malice, just the calm of inevitability. "He forgot too slowly," she said, brushing dust from the cradle's edge. "That makes it worse." Because resistance at this stage was no longer defiance, it was self-harm. The house didn't punish rebels. It revealed to them that they were not visitors. They were returnees, pieces of the cradle sent out into the world to eventually crawl back home. Matthew's failure wasn't weakness. It was completion. He hadn't tried to destroy the gate. He had finished it. And now, with him sealed into its frame, the passage was almost ready, not for travelers, but for something older, pressing against the veil from the other side, something that remembers the womb of stone, and once it opened. Then the cradle began to sing, no melody, no human tune, just a low, resonant vibration that passed through glass, through rib cages, through memory. The sound was not heard, but inherited. A kind of music the bones had always known, but had forgotten how to hum. Windows in Blackmore trembled. Mirrors cracked not from pressure, but from shame. The cemetery gates swung open on their own, though no wind stirred the grass, and one by one the graves began to shiver, stones shifting, soil sighing, not erupting upward, but collapsing inward, as if each tombstone marked not a resting place, but an entrance. Something below was waking, not alive, but aware. Inside Ravencrest, Eleanor rocked the cradle gently, and with each creak of its frame, another grave folded into itself. Not a resurrection. No. This was a collection. A pulling back of pieces loaned to the earth. Charlotte stood at the window, her fingertips dripping black ink as if she'd dipped them in the sky itself. "They're remembering," she whispered, "what they were before flesh." and Thomas, now silent and glass-eyed, simply turned toward the floorboards, because beneath them a heartbeat had begun to echo. People tried to flee. Horses refused to ride west. Cars stalled as if time itself had slipped from their engines. One woman made it to the tree line before the roots rose and wrapped around her legs, not to kill but to read her. She screamed as bark etched itself with her memories, veins turning to vines, her name rewritten into the bark in Eleanor's trembling script. She was not consumed. She was archived. And beneath every inch of Blackmore, the ground opened its eyes, because the dead do not stay dead in places where death is unfinished. They wait, not for salvation, but for structure, for the call back into form, for the song of the cradle to thread them into new shapes, new names, new roles, not reincarnation, and not resurrection, reassignment. Magnus had known this, had planned for this. Ravencrest wasn't a home, it was a keystone, a tuning fork struck once every century to awaken the infrastructure beneath memory, and now the house was nearly at full pitch. Only one grave remained unopened, yours. And then the last grave tilted, not broken, not burst, but gently leaned forward, like a priest bending to whisper final rites. Except the words it spoke weren't prayers. They were your dreams recited back to you in a voice that sounded eerily like your mother's, only lower, slower, older. The dreams were wrong, twisted at their core, nights you thought you remembered rethreaded with unfamiliar colors, faces blurred, meanings inverted. That time you ran from a shadow in the hallway, it hadn't been chasing you. It had been following you home. The birthday candle that wouldn't light, not a glitch, but a warning. And the woman you loved, her name was never hers. She was placed beside you as a buffer, a delay, because the grave knew something you didn't. You had never left Ravencrest. Not truly. You were sent out, a scout, a sleeper, one of many limbs, severed and walking until the song called them back. And now the final verse hummed under your skin. Your name was never your own. It was a label for containment. You were a mask over a mouth that hadn't yet spoken, and the grave was trying to remind you before it was too late to wake. But you didn't wake. You remembered. The childhood fever you survived wasn't a sickness. It was the moment of split, when the part of you buried under Ravencrest's floorboards separated from the shell that now sat reading these words. Your body was a receipt, a placeholder, and the grave had waited until now to speak because the story had to reach you first. Charlotte lit the final candle, not to see, but to signal. Eleanor closed the cradle, not to end, but to begin again. And your reflection in the window did not match your movement. It blinked before you did. It smiled wider. It whispered one word from the glass: return. Because the story wasn't just about the Halberts. It was about the structure that made them, and it needed you back tied, key in place before it could complete itself. The cradle is full now, but there's still room for one more name. And as the grave finished whispering your stolen memories, Eleanor opened the journal. Its spine cracked like it had waited centuries to breathe again. The pages trembled, not from wind, but from recognition. She ran her gloved fingers across the ink and smiled, because the handwriting on every page was yours. Not similar, not mimicked, yours. The loops, the hesitations, the subtle slant on the letter G. You had never written this book, yet every page remembered your pressure, your intention, your breath. And when Eleanor began to read aloud, you heard the words before she spoke them, because you weren't hearing them, you were remembering them. The journal began with a date, December 24th, 1741, a day you never lived, a winter you never felt. And yet the frost from that time traced your windows now. The ink described the creation of the cradle, not as a crib for children, but as a vessel to hold unfinished souls, to preserve what cannot end, and to end what cannot be preserved, you had written, and I must be the last to forget. The pages turned faster as if the book were impatient. The words blurred, then reformed. They told of the first separation, how you were divided, how a fragment of your consciousness had been buried under the foundation stones of Ravencrest, waiting for your return. It had waited through revolutions, through fires, through floods, through false lives and renamed cities. It had waited through you. Charlotte entered the room with the ink-stained doll and placed it gently beside the journal. "He remembers," she said. "Now we can begin." And Eleanor, still smiling, turned to the final page, a blank sheet. Except it wasn't blank, it was wet. Fresh ink bled into your name, letter by letter, spelling not what you were, but what you were about to become. The cradle groaned. The candles inverted their flames, and somewhere deep inside your scope, all a pressure built, not pain, but a sensation like a door opening inward, because the story had turned. It was no longer about the Halberts. It was being written by you, and it would not end until you stopped reading. Charlotte didn't speak as she entered, only held the ink-stained doll like it was something holy or haunted or both. She moved with the careful grace of someone performing a rite, not new, but endlessly repeated through generations that never breathed, only waited. She placed the doll inside the cradle, tucking it under the thin, black blanket embroidered with names, not names you knew, but names your teeth ached to say. Then she began to hum. Not a song you could place, not at first. But the longer she hummed, the more your heart twisted. Because it was your lullaby, the one your mother used when you were sick, the one that made the monsters in your room go quiet. Except it wasn't being sung. It was being unwoven. The notes were reversed, descending like water running uphill, syllables stretched into shadow. It was the same melody, but rewritten to unmake comfort, to strip nostalgia into revelation. You realized then that your lullaby had never been yours. It had been the activation code, a sleep chant meant to hold your memory in stasis until the cradle called you home. The doll's button eyes glistened as if wet. Its stitched smile widened, not from thread but from within. The cradle rocked once, twice, and the room shifted around it, not physically but architecturally, as if space itself remembered a different arrangement. Walls elongated, doors vanished, time hiccuped. In the mirror above the mantel, your reflection had no eyes. Eleanor whispered, "It's begun." Beneath the floor, a heartbeat louder than thunder, slower than death. The journal slammed shut on its own, but you didn't flinch. You couldn't. You were no longer watching this story. You were inhabiting it. Charlotte turned to you and asked, "What did she hum to you the first night they took you from the cradle?" You open your mouth, and the answer falls out like dust made of teeth, because we adopted. You were deployed, now retrieved, now realigned, now remembered, and the cradle, once used to rock infants into rest, now rocks the world into reawakening. There will be no more lullabies, only the rhythm of returning function. Without a word, Eleanor crossed the room, knelt beside the fireplace, and began prying up the floorboards with her bare, withered hands. The wood came away easier than it should have, as if it had been waiting to open, not resisting, but releasing. And beneath it wasn't dirt, nor stone, nor even the expected rot of time. It was a pattern, etched into the subfloor in something that wasn't quite bone, wasn't quite ash. A massive, spiraling glyph like a spider's web spun by something with fingers instead of legs. The lines pulsed faintly, the way veins pulse just before a body goes still. Eleanor touched the center and whispered, "Do you remember this shape?" And you did. Not from this life, but from the space between your first breath and the last time you were whole. This wasn't a grave. It was a schematic, a soul map, a diagram drawn before you were ever born, marking not who you would be, but what you had been before you were erased. Every curve of the pattern told a different truth. One line described the sound of your voice in a language no longer spoken. Another encoded the date of your final death, the one that hadn't happened yet. Charlotte traced the outer ring with her fingertip, and it lit up, dim, red, hungry. "You were made to be more than a man," she whispered. "You were made to remember the pattern that undoes forgetting." The air thickened, not with smoke, not with heat, but with density, as if time had slowed to let you choose. But it was too late to choose. You'd already been chosen. Your name was etched at the center of the glyph, not the name you answered to, but the one you fled from lifetime after lifetime. and the glyph began to rise. Not figuratively, literally, the ash and bone spiral lifted itself from the ground like a three-dimensional engraving made of memory, marrow, and mandate. The room stretched upward, impossibly tall, the ceiling cracked out. Pen revealing not sky, but another chamber above it, and inside it another you, not breathing, not alive, but waiting. And when the chamber above opened fully, the silence didn't break. It recoiled, like a breath held too long in a dead throat. Suspended there was another you, not a twin, not a clone, but the remainder. The version that stayed behind when your consciousness was excised and repackaged into this life. His skin was pale, papery, marked with the same glyphs you'd just seen etched into the floor. But these were inward, burned beneath the skin like memories sealed in scar tissue. His eyes opened, and they weren't eyes. They were mirrors, reflecting your every failure, lie, compromise, and betrayal across every incarnation. You didn't move, but he inhaled sharply, and your own lungs ached as though the breath had been siphoned through your rib cage into his. You didn't feel duplicated. You felt robbed. Charlotte whispered, "He's the one who remembered, while you forgot. But now you're both here, and there can't be two." The chamber trembled, and the glyph below began to spin, not physically, but perceptually, as if time itself was being stirred by unseen hands. Eleanor reached out, not to comfort you, but to guide you into position, like a relic being placed back in its socket. "This body is only a draft," she said, gesturing to you. "That one was the blueprint. But the soul must decide, merge or consume." And your other self began to smile, slowly, without malice, with understanding. He mouthed a word. You couldn't hear it, but you felt it in the roots of your teeth. "Return." Then he began to move, not step, but descend, not down a ladder or stair, but through the very geometry of the chamber, like falling through intention itself. As he approached, your spine locked, your hands clenched. You couldn't run. You were never meant to. This wasn't a confrontation, it was a reclamation. And when his fingers touched your chest, right over the sternum, you felt heat, not from outside, from deep within, like something trapped beneath your rib cage had just remembered it was made of fire. He stepped into you, and you did not scream. You spoke. The words came out like rusted gears snapping into place. "I was divided to forget. I returned to remember." The glyph stopped spinning. The cradle stopped rocking. And you were complete, for the first time in centuries. But the cost of memory had only just begun. And when your eyes opened again, it wasn't waking, it was activation. You weren't lying in the cradle. You were the cradle. The wood beneath your spine flexed as if responding to breath, and your skin felt tight, not from fear, but from capacity. The air around you shimmered, faintly humming with recognition. Charlotte stepped back. Eleanor bowed, not out of reverence, but compliance. Because the glyph had stopped spinning, yes, but it hadn't gone still. It had sunk into your bloodstream. Your veins were no longer red. They were pulsing lines of the same ash and bone script that had once lined the floor. Every heartbeat now whispered instructions you didn't need to interpret. You understood them like muscle memory, like an architect waking in a building he once built in his sleep. Eleanor whispered, "It held. After all this time, it held." The others emerged from the walls. Not doors, not shadows, but the walls themselves, like they had been part of the structure all along. Figures you didn't recognize, but who all recognized you. Their faces bore the same rigidity. Their breath came not from lungs, but from the echo of your own. They weren't people. They were extensions, prototypes, failures, or worse, successful early models. And they knelt, not in ceremony, in compliance, because something ancient had just stood up inside your bones, something they hadn't seen in centuries, not since the glyph was last etched into a living host. Charlotte placed her hand over her heart. Function 1 restored. Eleanor, root protocol engaged. You looked down at your hands. The skin blistered, cracked, and fell away like paper. Beneath it, black glass, threaded with red gold circuitry, pulsing in time with your thoughts. You weren't a body anymore. You were a language written in heat and gravity, and from the ceiling above, a chain of bones uncoiled, descending like a spinal cord hook. Dang from heaven, it touched your shoulder, fused. The glyph flickered through your iris, and every wall in the house breathed in. And as the chain of bone fused to your spine, something beneath the floor groaned, not like wood or stone, but like vertebrae, like a rib cage that had been holding its breath for 200 years. The house shuddered, not from wind, not from storm, but from recognition. You were not inside Ravencrest. You were inside a body. Its halls were arteries, its rooms were organs, and its very foundation had been laid in obedience to your eventual return. Eleanor raised her arms. "It awakens," she whispered, and the wallpaper peeled away in strips, revealing flesh beneath. Pale, pulsing, and stitched in place with blackened wire. Every doorframe twitched. The fireplace exhaled steam. The windows clouded, not from fog, but from tears the house had not been permitted to shed until its mind re-entered its skull. Because you were not just its master. You were its missing hemisphere. Charlotte pressed her palm to the wall, and it responded, rippling outward like water reacting to sound. "It remembers," she said. "It remembers the limb it lost when you were cleaved from the blueprint." The glyphs in your arms lit brighter, hotter, reaching into the walls around you, rewriting them in your syntax. A library unfolded from the wallpaper. A staircase unfurled from the ceiling, descending like a tongue. The architecture was obeying now, reorganizing itself to match your restored form. And still the others knelt. Outside, the villagers of Blackmore stood frozen at the edge of the forest, watching the manor rise, not vertically, but inward, folding in dimensions the eye could not measure. One moment it was stone, the next it was bone, then metal, then something like a cathedral wrapped in skin. Lights inside flickered like neurons reactivating. The weather vane twisted violently, not with wind, but with magnetic intent. The glyph wasn't a symbol, it was a command. You hadn't returned to the house. You had returned to yourself. And Ravencrest, long mistaken for ruins, was simply a skull waiting for the brain to reattach. It didn't creak now. It breathed, and with each breath it remembered another function, another protocol, another truth you were born to execute. And then, without warning, without thunder or trumpet, Ravencrest spoke. Not in sound, not in language, but in impulse. A psychic waveform that rippled across the moors, passed through trees, bypassed lungs, and entered skulls like an unwanted memory. All across Blackmore and far beyond, the sleeping began to stir. Eyes fluttered, teeth clenched, dreams fractured and reformed into one shape. You. No mouth had moved. But every sleeper heard the same phrase. The architect has returned. Prepare your dead. It wasn't prophecy. It was instruction. And the glyph that once glowed faintly inside your veins now pulsed in the minds of men across oceans, cities, prisons, hospitals, anywhere the human mind still wandered in sleep and the soul begged to remember. It was no longer a house. It was no longer a man. You were now signal, transmitted through architecture, received through bone. Inside the chamber, Eleanor collapsed, her body unable to withstand the new pressure. Charlotte knelt beside her, whispering apologies not to her, but to you, as if your awakening had demanded payment in blood, in lineage, in silence shattered by inevitability. And still the cradle pulsed. The glyph no longer needed carving, painting, or speech. It projected itself, casting its geometry into the minds of all who had once known the old language and forgotten. Old masons wept in their beds. Blind monks gasped, seeing for the first time in 40 years. Glyphs burned into their retina like sunlight through stained glass. Somewhere a child woke up, reciting symbols that hadn't been spoken since before the flood. And all of them asked the same question without knowing why. Is he building again? You stood at the window, no longer observing the world, but infecting it. Every brick in Ravencrest now held memory. Every hallway channeled thought, and every dead Halbert, every preserved figure placed throughout. The manor opened their eyes in unison. Not to live, but to serve. They turned toward you, ancient dust sloughing from their sockets, and bowed. Your house had become your voice. Your voice had become the command, and sleep across the world had become your audience. And then it came, not a moment, not an event, but a reveal so old that the world had already buried it in dream. The floor, beneath the cradle, beneath the glyph, beneath the house's every corridor and wall began to separate, not collapse, but unseal. Stone pulled away from stone in geometric precision, not rubble, but revelation. What lay beneath was not basement, not dungeon, not soil, but a vault carved in black bone and inlaid with runes so old they predated alphabet. The Halberts hadn't built Ravencrest to live in it. They built it to contain what they found. You descended barefoot, unshaking, glyphs in your skin, glowing now in response to the thing waiting below. It wasn't hidden. It was guarded by you. The vault pulsed once, and you remembered all of it. Before Blackmore, before Scotland, before bodies, before death was even a word. You remembered the first blueprint drawn in fire across the void. You remembered the original glyph, not as a mark, but as a being. And you remembered your oath, to wear flesh so the world would forget, to return only when the fracture spread too wide to be ignored. Below, in the center of the vault, a cradle older than the one above, made of iron, bone, and something like compressed light, flickering like a dying sun. Inside it lay a child, or the memory of one. Still, unrotted, preserved not through chemicals but agreement. Its face was yours, not now, but before. The version of you that made the first cut, the first glyph, the first law, and as you stepped into the vault, your presence ignited the final sequence. All throughout Ravencrest, the corpses rose, not to rebel, but to serve. All across the world, dreamers sat up, no longer asleep, no longer fully awake, but ready. The glyph left your body and floated upward, unfolding like a skeletal wing, casting patterns into the air that spoke only to those with the first memory still burning in their blood. And the child in the cradle opened its eyes, eyes older than time, deeper than structure, sharper than death, and it whispered, "Build," and you answered, "Yes."